The honourable member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that this bill be now read a second time. I'm very pleased to be giving this second reading speech today. Since this bill was introduced, I have received support from a very broad cross-section of the community for the measures it proposes. That support has been bipartisan and includes the Sydney Airport Community Forum, which met last week and passed a motion calling for support for this bill or similar legislation. I am pleased to report that the motion was carried with only one dissenting vote being cast by the aviation industry representative. I have also received letters and telephone calls of support from many residents, not just in my electorate but from throughout Sydney, and a number of councils affected by Kingsford Smith Airport, including Botany, North Sydney, Leichhardt, Marrickville and South Sydney. There is very broad support for this measure. Now today I have received endorsement for this measure of none other than the Minister for Transport, John Sharp. This is a perfect example of the Minister playing the politics of catch-up. He put out two press releases today. The first, in which he stated, is headed "Sydney Airport Aircraft Movements Cap to be legislated," in which he said that he would be introducing government legislation to impose a cap of 80 aircraft movements per hour at Sydney Airport. And in it, the reason why he said he would introduce his own legislation is because he said, and I quote, "Mr Albanese's private member's bill has a number of technical flaws." You would have expected the Minister, with a whole department at his disposal, to have then gone on to outline those flaws. But he didn't do it. Not a single one. Not a mention of a problem with this legislation. So then what did the Minister do? He put out another press release, deleting that sentence. Deleting that sentence so that now, in the Minister's press release Mark 2, headed "Legislation introduced for Sydney Airport," we have the Minister foreshadowing his own legislation by the government in opposition to mine, but without stating a single reason of why that is necessary, given that my bill, I believe, covers all necessary technical legislation. No details in either of his press releases, no timetable, most importantly, for when that legislation would be introduced. But despite this, I can give a commitment on behalf of the opposition that we will support a government bill so long as it achieves the following objective. That is, that it's a tight bill, along with my private member's bill, and not just a watering down of the legislation which I've forwarded before this House today. No maybes, no broad discretions, but a tight bill. No exemptions for VIPs and Air Force jets going in and out. No exemptions for the Olympics or special sporting events. Tight legislation. If the government is fair dinkum and introduces legislation, which I know has the support, and I acknowledge has the support of members around Sydney Airport across both sides of this chamber, then we will in fact show we are fair dinkum and not worry about who's moving what, but show that we're concerned with the results. Mr Deputy Speaker, if this bill is passed into law, it would draw a line in the sand for those who wish Sydney Airport to grow to unsustainable limits. The aviation industry and some elements of the tourism lobby, who say there should be no limit to the size of KSA, are not in touch with reality. Kingsford Smith Airport is growing at a rate which far exceeds all previous expectations. Forecasts from the discredited draft DIS into the third runway predicted that movements would increase from 206,000 in 1988 to 340,000 in the year 2010, a growth rate of 2.3%. In reality, this growth has been much higher. From 85 to 94, the actual average growth in aircraft movements was 5.59%. The most recent figures are even more concerning. In the 6-month period from November 95 to April 96, aircraft movements grew by 9.6% compared with the previous year average. The Bureau of Transport and Communications Economics working paper, entitled Adequacy of Transport Infrastructure, shared this view. The Bureau suggested that KSA's ultimate capacity of 353,000 movements per year could be reached as early as the year 2003. It is clear that Sydney Airport does have a limit and that that limit is fast approaching. Despite policies of sharing the noise, there's no doubt that there are thousands of residents in my electorate who are still subjected to excessive aircraft noise. In fact, many hundreds of people in my electorate sold their homes under the old flight path at a massive loss and moved to unaffected neighbouring areas. They're now being plagued with the noise they paid dearly to escape. These people were presumably encouraged by the Prime Minister's commitment that there will be no new flights over the seat of Low, and many moved in that direction. John Howard was very clear about this commitment prior to the election. His press release dated 8th of February 96 stated that there will be no new flight paths over Ashfield, Strathfield, roads, etc. Low will not be affected in the future. In the light of the Prime Minister's unequivocal commitments, it was interesting to receive the maps of the 10 new modes of proposed operations for Sydney Airport at last week's SACF meeting. Not one new flight path over Low, but 7 new flight paths over Low. 4 going out, 3 coming in. So no wonder that we're not prepared to just take Minister Sharp's press release at face value. We want to actually see the legislation introduced in this House. The only problem with the SACF meeting was that there were no usage or capacity figures provided with the maps. In other words, members were told where the planes would go, but not how often they would go there. We were told that the preferred mode was Mode 4 over the waters of Botany Bay. I think Air Services Australia thought that would make us happy. Trust us, we're honest. But there isn't a lot of faith in government or in governmental organisations regarding Sydney Airport, because when we were finally given the figures, we were told that this preferred mode, so-called, would only operate 5 to 10% of the time. In fact, a conservative tally of the modes that would see movements over the north, east or west totalled 74%. The modes that revert the airport to the noisy parallel operations will be used 45 to 50% of the time, and they deliver a capacity of over 87 movements per hour. Noise levels may have dropped in some areas, but they are destined to become significantly worse if nothing is done to restrain capacity and there is no second airport. Mr Speaker, time does not allow me to elaborate on the many other impacts that Sydney Airport has on our area, including ground noise, air pollution and traffic congestion, not to mention the danger of a plane crash in Australia's most densely populated area. These all lead to the same conclusion. In human and economic terms, we cannot afford Sydney Airport to grow. As I stated in my first reading speech, the commitment of the Coalition to this measure is clear. Page 8 of Putting People First, the Coalition's policy on Sydney Airport of 29 January, states that the Coalition will cap aircraft movements at 80 movements per hour. That commitment is clear and cannot be denied. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill cannot succeed without the construction of a second airport. I am totally committed, as is the opposition, to the construction of a second airport at Badgerys Creek. This is not a NIMBY attitude. I'm tired of those who say this debate is about inner city people wanting to dump their problems somewhere else. I challenge these people to go to Sydenham or Tempe or Marrickville and find me houses full of yuppies. They simply don't exist. My seat has a higher percentage of families with incomes below $16,000 and a lower average family income than either Prospect or Greenway. In the Lindsay by-election, there was a candidate, a high-profile candidate called Kay Villa, who ran against Badgerys Creek Airport. Well, her campaign didn't get off the ground. She couldn't garner any support, ran about 7th and couldn't get 1% of the vote. But it's clear that the longer we prevaricate on the actual construction of a second airport, the more desperate the situation will become. We need to build it, and we need to build it now. I've outlined the reasons why this bill must be supported. A vote for this bill is a vote for a limit to noise at KSA. A vote for this bill is a vote for airline safety. A vote for this bill is a vote for better planning of our airport needs. A vote for this bill is a vote to ensure the government keeps its promises. A vote for this bill is a vote for certainty and security for the residents of Sydney. We await with anticipation the introduction of the government bill. We will not be withdrawing my legislation until such time as we have a chance to analyse that bill and to see how fair income the minister actually is. And until that point, I urge all members to support my bill.
Is the motion seconded? The honourable member for Watson.
Second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
The question is the motion be agreed to. The honourable member for Lowe.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, whilst it's true that I not only seconded the motion put forward by the honourable member for Grayndler at the last last Monday's meeting of the Sydney Airport Community Forum, I even moved for the matter to be brought forward by an urgency motion so that the matter can be discussed. However, what the honourable member for Grayndler did not state in this speech today was that I supported his motion at the SACF meeting, but in principle only, as it is very similar to government policy. What I did say at the SACF meeting, and what I repeat in the Parliament today, is that the so-called Albanese bill, as currently drafted, has, in my view, a number of technical and legal difficulties, and I'll be very glad to elaborate on the technical and legal difficulties later in my speech. And as a result, the government will reject the passage of this bill in its present form for these specific reasons. Having said that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is nonetheless heartening to see the now opposition adopting coalition policy, however belatedly. It is, and I believe, incumbent on me to point out to the House that the opposition's posturing on the issue of a cap is in stark contrast to their stance on the issue prior to the election, which was a policy of not having a policy on the cap at KSA. It is interesting to note, Mr. Deputy Speaker, how the ALP is gradually adopting all the coalition policies regarding aircraft movements at KSA. Firstly, in regards to the curfew, then in regards to the support for the coalition's rejection of the privatisation of KSA until the aircraft noise issues are adequately addressed. I pause at this moment, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to reflect and remember how prior to the 2nd of March election, the then Minister for Transport, who's now in the chamber, the Honourable Member for Kingsford Smith, attacked the coalition for our stance on this issue, only to now see a total about-face. In fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure that honourable members who have an interest in the issue of aircraft noise will remember the vehemence of the attack from the ALP towards the coalition for supposedly wrecking the airport sale progress. We now see another turnaround from the ALP in attempting to again copy coalition policy in regards to the capping of movements at KSA to not more than 80 movements per hour. However, the answer, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the cap is not comprehensively and adequately addressed by a hurried and poorly drafted private member's bill from the honourable member for Grayndler, which comes after some 13 years of scandalous mismanagement of KSA by the ALP. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I take up the challenge by the honourable member for Grayndler in regards to the specifics and the inadequacies of the bill, and whilst time is running out in regards to the other matters I want to raise, I'll go into some detail on the problems in his bill. Part 2, Clause 4, as it relates to the limitation of aircraft movements. No mention, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is made as to who has the responsibility for ensuring the limits are not breached. A very important and crucial omission. I go on, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I refer to Part 3 of the bill. I see the honourable member for Grayndler has a copy of the bill before him. And I pause there, Part 3 of the bill, as it relates to the provisions of information. This part of the bill is singularly unclear as to the policy intention behind the provisions. Further, Mr. Deputy Speaker, does the Minister table reports on airport operations only if the cap has been exceeded? What if the cap is not exceeded? Does he then have to lodge a report no matter what happens? The bill is silent on this matter. I'm also concerned, I go further, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I go further. I'm also concerned with aspects of the bill as contained in Part 4 as an example, as it refers to injunctions, in particular with clauses 8 and 9, which will override the federal court's own rules on standing. Also of concern, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in subclause 9 little brackets, little 2, which will do nothing, absolutely nothing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to discourage vexatious litigants. And we all know what a cost that'll be on the government with these people who will attempt and do everything they can to take the government to court for vexatious acts. Further, well, you've issued the challenge. I'm responding to your challenge. Further, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I refer to Schedule 1 of the bill. Amendments of the Airports Act 1996 will have the highly undesired effect of bypassing the public comment processes and submissions from the airport and aircraft operators, ASA and CASA, which incidentally was not supported by the opposition in the Senate in this parliamentary session. Additionally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, further in regards to the matters raised by the honourable member for Grayndler, is specifically in regards to the failures of as contained in this bill, the rush and the haste to produce this private member's bill is further evidenced by a number of drafting errors. For instance, the reference to Section 3 in subclause 5 little 1 should refer to Section 4. The reference to Section 7 in subclause 7 little 1 should refer to Section 6. The reference to Section 7 in subclause 9.1 should refer to Section 8, and the reference to Section 7 in subclause 9(2) in brackets should refer to Section 8. Conversely, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased this morning to note that the Minister for Transport, the Honourable John Sharp, has confirmed that the Coalition will soon present a government bill comprehensively and thoroughly researched to cap aircraft movements at KSA to no more than 80 per hour. This will occur, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in regards to the interjection from the honourable member for Grayndler, who says when. It will occur early in 1997. Following early next year, we're just about at the end of the year, following the completion of reports to the Minister by two separate working groups that are established and are now well advanced in their examination of the scope for the use of economic instruments and committee-based slot allocation processes. Specific reference, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will be made to ensure that the nature of the slot system developed for Sydney will be best suited to its particular requirements, including the need to accommodate regional airline services. I conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by applauding the Minister for Transport in honouring the Coalition's commitment, and in so doing, I quote from the Minister's press release issued today, which states, and I quote, "This decision to enshrine the movement gap in legislation puts beyond doubt the government's commitment to honour its election promises in relation to Sydney Airport." Mr. Deputy Speaker, all who are aircraft noise affected residents of Sydney will no doubt now feel secure in the knowledge that guarantees in the form of legislation will ensure that a cap will remain in force as long as the Coalition remains in government, and that will be for a long, long time.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the honourable member for Watson.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Leo
Deputy Speaker.
McClay,
I've got great pleasure in seconding
Chief Opposition Whip,
this
Labor,
bill.
New South Wales.
And after hearing the contribution from the member for Lowe, one wonders why the government's not going to support it. The nitpicking proposals that he put forward there about how this clause ought to be a subclause here and there, well, of course, they, as he should know, they can easily be fixed up when we get to the consideration in detail stage of this bill. Of course, if the member for Lowe thinks that everything should come in here as pristine as he's now suggesting, then he ought to go and have a talk to the Leader of the House, because if the member for Lowe recalls, when the government introduced the workplace bill recently, the government had to come back with some hundreds of amendments. Pages and pages and pages of amendments were brought forward by the government. So if the only nitpicking opposition the government can come up to this bill is that we should make these small amendments, the member for Grayndler and I would be more than happy to accommodate any of those type of amendments that the member for Lowe or anyone else on the government side might want to move. But the problem is, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that the government doesn't really want this piece of legislation passed. The member for Lowe talks about how this is coalition policy. Well, of course, the member for Lowe, who often has a short memory about these things, seeing as the government's rolled over him on the flight paths, he might recall that in the going to the election, when we went to the election, that it was the Labor Party's policy that we have 80 movements an hour, and it was what we decided we were going to do. And the fact is that the member for Grayndler and I aren't interested really in this nitpicking argument. If the government is willing to bring in complementary legislation which does what we have said in this, we're more than happy to go along with it once we see it. But the trouble you've got with this government is when they sort of get down to the fine print, we'll find in the bill that the minister brings in that there'll be lots and lots and lots of let-outs. You'll have VIP aircraft will be let out so that the Prime Minister and his mates can fly into the airport at any time they like. You'll have them with this let out and that let out. You'll have the Minister for Veterans Affairs want them to let defence aircraft have a let out. And of course the VIP aircraft, are defence aircraft, and he says it's not his portfolio. And that's right, but he spends a lot of his time in them. We all know that, Mr Deputy Speaker. He spends a lot of his time in them. Now, what the member for Grayndler and I are saying here is that the people who live around Sydney Airport have put up with the problems of the noise there for long enough. And what we want is that the number of movements there be limited to 80 an hour. That's what the EIS was constructed on the airport about, and we should enshrine that in legislation. The government have received advice, and we know about this, they've received advice that the airport can operate at about 120 movements an hour, and that the people in the finance area of the government are very keen that this piece of legislation shouldn't be passed, because they know that they can go out, if they can get this legislation knocked off, they can go out on the quiet and say to the people who want to buy Sydney Airport, well, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the cap is the operational cap of 80 movements an hour, but if you buy the airport and give us a better price, we'll let you run it up to 120 movements an hour. Now that's the go. The government know that's the go. There are people around putting out that story right now. So the proof in this is in the pudding. We have caused, by putting this bill forward, the government to come to the party. Because if we hadn't put this bill forward, there was no way the government was ever going to come in here suggesting that they would do anything. The member for Lowe and the member for North Sydney and the member for Cook, they've all gone along to these community meetings and said, oh yes, we support this now. Well, they never supported it until we put it forward. They never came up with it until we put it forward, until we did it. So we have had an effect on the government. What I would say to the government is, the member for Grayndler and I are more than happy to support some honest legislation from the government which will implement what this bill says. They can go on with all the nitpicking they like, we're happy, we'll cop it. But the undertaking we want from the government is, and I'd like to hear from the future speakers on this bill now, the undertaking we want is, when will the minister be bringing in his bill, how quickly will they want to pass it, and when will the people around Sydney Airport get some relief by the government getting off this stupid idea of building an airport at Holsworthy and get on with the construction of Badgerys Creek, because those of us who live around the airport know that that is the only way to resolve the pressure on Sydney Airport, so that we won't have people trying to do away with the curfew, so we won't have people trying to exceed the number of movements per hour. Results for our constituents is what we want. If the government's willing to accommodate that, we're willing to accommodate them.
Order.
But we want to
the
do it
honourable
honestly.
member's time has expired. The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the honourable member for North Sydney.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Joe Hockey, Liberal
I've had
New
the
South
pleasure
Wales.
over the last 7 days of chairing 6 public meetings around the Sydney Basin in relation to aircraft noise. They were held at Willoughby, Marrickville, Randwick, Drummoyne, South Hurstville and Cronulla. And there was one overwhelming message that came out of those public meetings, and that is that the community is very cynical about anything that the Labor Party is proposing in relation to aircraft noise. They are extremely cynical, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it was the Labor Party that burnt the bridges on this issue between the community and the government. It was the Labor Party that raised a town called Good Faith, and they raised that town by setting up the third runway, by trying to concentrate the noise over a limited number of people. The net result is that the community has had enough of the Labor Party, and they are extremely cynical about every proposal coming out of the Labor Party in relation to aircraft noise. There have been 2 significant factors, Mr Deputy Speaker, that have occurred in relation to this matter since the 2nd of March. I can understand the member for Grayndler trying to rebuild the credibility of the Labor Party on this issue, and he's done that in 2 particular ways. Firstly, and it must have given him a great sense of satisfaction as a member of the left, to be able to initiate in caucus a proposal that the ALP would dump privatisation of Kingsford Smith Airport until such time as the noise problems were fixed. Now that sounds a lot to me like the policy that the Liberal Party took to the 2nd of March election. It was the Labor Party that wanted to sell the airport. It was the Labor Party that wanted to sell the airport straight away with no cap, And it was the Labor Party that built the 3rd runway that enabled the airport to get up to the so-called 120 movements an hour. It's the Liberal Party that has taken the right action here. We've set the cap on Sydney Airport. We said it was 80 movements an hour. And then the Labor Party said, well, we'll go for 85. They weren't even outbidding us. And yet, now they're proposing to try and introduce legislation at 80 movements an hour. We've got no problem with that, no problem whatsoever. It's our policy. You're trying to come over to our side of the field. Secondly, as I pointed out in relation to privatisation, it was the Labor Party that wanted to sell Kingsford Smith straight away. Get it out of the way, get rid of the problem. Well, we said that we'd try and fix it, Mr Deputy Speaker, and we've set about doing that. We've gone to the people. We've spoken with the community. I can't remember the member for Kingsford Smith, who unfortunately has chosen to step out of the chamber just before I spoke. I cannot remember the member for Kingsford Smith chairing any public meetings, and yet I'm going into his electorate to chair public meetings in his electorate with his community who are expressing concerns about aircraft noise. Well, I don't have to do the job of you. I'd encourage you to go and speak to your own constituents about the problems. Mr Deputy Speaker, we've pointed out that there are some technical flaws in this bill, and we're doing exactly the same thing as the Labor Party did when they were in government. We're saying that as a government we think we can have a better bill. And as my colleague, the member for Lowe, pointed out, the technical problems are identified in parts 2, 3 and 4, and that's clause 4 of part 2. Schedule 1 in relation to the amendment to section 210 of the Airports Act 1996, and even drafting errors are in place, Mr Deputy Speaker, in relation to subclauses 5.1, 7.1, 9.1 and 9.2. As was pointed out by the member for Grayndler and a number of other speakers, the Sydney Airport Community Forum, which I chair, passed a resolution supporting the concept of putting into place legislation which would turn the cap into law. Mr Deputy Speaker, bad legislation, in my view, leads to bad law. At this stage, this is bad legislation. We've seen enough of the ALP's rhetoric about what they want to do at Kingsford Smith Airport. They've had enough of a chance to screw up the airport. Leave it to the government. The government's doing a good job. We're getting there. We're rebuilding the bridges that you burnt, and we are rebuilding the town of good faith in relation to aircraft noise at Sydney.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the honourable member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Firstly, if I could point out to the House that a number of the drafting errors referred to by the member for Lowe and the member for North Sydney appeared in an earlier draft, and it's quite evident on the face of the document that that they haven't studied the final text as has been prepared. But addressing some of the issues raised by the member for Lowe, he said the part 3 of the document was unclear on policy. Well, no act that I've ever read, aside from the objects clause, ever states policy. The policy is set out in the explanatory memorandum and indeed the second reading speech. He said it was silent as to whether a report was required if a cap was not exceeded. Well, the simple answer to that is who cares? If the report is required, the report is required obviously for a prosecution, and clearly no prosecution is contemplated if the cap is not exceeded. And the other complaints were in respect to part 4, I think clauses 8 and 9, saying it overrode federal court right of intervention provisions. What he's saying is he wants to make it too tough for residents who have been affected to get involved in the court proceedings and have their say. The next provision was criticism of the removal of potential cost penalties against litigants, and again, that protection would have facilitated ordinary people who are affected by aircraft noise to have had their say in court. But as I say, the facts of the matter is that fundamentally an earlier draft has been referred to in terms of several
drafting errors which occurred in the earlier draft but have been remedied. The facts of the matter is that 1997 is far too long, and certainly, and it seems quite ridiculous that legislation is proposed only after two separate working groups give a report to the government. What happens if the working groups give contradictory reports? Anyone knows. Presumably you've got to have a third report. Delay is of the essence, time is of the essence. The member for North Sydney, with respect, said that Labor's policy on opposing the privatisation of Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport was akin to the Liberal National Party coalition's policy when they opposed the privatisation last year. Well, I strongly disagree with that. That's not so. The Liberal National Party's opposition to the privatisation of Kingsford Smith Airport last year prevented Badgerys Creek going ahead. If that had have been privatised, the provisions were there for the funding of Badgerys Creek. $156 million has already been spent. We would have Badgerys Creek up and running by the Olympics. Instead, we are looking right down the track of well and truly into the next century and possibly beyond the first decade of the first century. On the 2nd of October, the Minister for Defence, Industry, Science and Personnel, or rather I should say the senior advisor to the Minister, wrote to a resident who would be affected by Holsworthy and said that the government had no plans. I'll stick to the text. It said that it wouldn't be necessary to relocate a hospital constructed at Holsworthy for about 10 years until Holsworthy became up and running, if the government went ahead with Holsworthy. We all know Holsworthy has got problems. It is a farce. Badgerys Creek was a done deal. $156 million had been spent. The money allocated in the forward estimates in last year's budget has been removed by this government, and they have spent it on a fundamentally flawed EIS for Holsworthy, which is just putting this back and delaying it longer and delaying it longer, and that's what this government is about. Delay is to the benefit of the big airline companies. Delay is to the benefit of the Federal Airports Corporation, and the government's backing that delay at the cost of the residents that we all represent. And I would have thought the members opposite would have backed this bill to get it up and running now, to put the cap in place to end some of the suffering that all our constituents are affected by. Thank you.
Well, the question is that this bill be now read a second time. The honourable member for Cook.
Deputy Speaker, I support in principle the Sydney Airport Regulation of Movements Bill of 1996. The bill seeks to limit the number of aircraft movements at Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport. I support the principle of the bill because it attempts to enshrine coalition policy announced at the last election after careful consideration by our then aviation spokesman, Senator Warwick Pera. Our precise commitment was that the coalition will cap movements at 80 movements per hour by implementing a slot system. This commitment is already being honoured. The development of the slot system is already well advanced, and in his directions to Air Services Australia in the setting up of the task force to look at the long-term operations of KSA, the Minister for Transport and Regional Development stipulated the non-negotiable basis of the cap. It is interesting to note that a group of ALP senators proposed a less stringent cap of 85 movements in the Senate Select Committee report entitled Falling on Deaf Ears. What a pertinent metaphor for 13 years of Labor government, falling on deaf ears. So it is pleasing to see that the honourable member for Grayndler seeks to identify himself with our policy and disassociate himself from the ALP, which has no credibility whatsoever on the aircraft noise issue. The honourable member endorses our policy, but of course his bill is a political stunt. A good stunt, but a stunt nevertheless. I was one of 3 federal Liberal members who supported a motion moved last week at the Sydney Airport Community Forum, which says that the Sydney Airport Community Forum supports the Sydney Airport Regulation of Movements Bill 1996 in principle, or similar legislation which would enshrine a restricted capacity of up to 80 movements in any 1 hour at KSA. We believe a second Sydney airport would enable this capacity to be reduced in the future. That motion was moved by the Honourable Member for Grayndler and seconded by the Honourable Member for Lowe. I emphasise the last paragraph because it is at the heart of this issue. With a growth rate at KSA of 4 to 5%, it is obvious that we need a second airport to service Sydney. If it wasn't for the prevarication of the previous government, we would be well on the way to having a second airport to service Sydney. Now, of course, the scene has changed, and the choice of a second airport is fraught with difficulties. But if we don't have a second airport, pressure will continue to increase on KSA, and madcap schemes such as the proposal to build a 4th runway in the middle of Botany Bay will gain more credence. God forbid that the ALP should ever be re-elected, but the Freddy Krueger of Australian politics, although dead, is still kicking, and the nightmare to contemplate is the Honourable Member for Kingsford Smith officiating one day at the opening of the 4th runway. Although it is a long-term aim, when the second airport is operational, it is my view that all curfew operations from KSA should be transferred and the number of non-curfew operations reduced to a more tolerable level. Because this bill is a political stunt, it has not been properly thought out. We have been given a brief by the Minister on all the technical difficulties apparent in the present bill. It is the responsibility of the government to ensure that our policy is implemented effectively, and the Minister has been doing this in a responsible manner. I support the principle of the bill. I will vote to support the legislation to be introduced by the Minister at the appropriate time. It must be said that the ALP has no credibility whatsoever on this issue. That's to be evidenced by the fact that in the area of Kurnell, the long-suffering people of Kurnell gave me a 20% swing to win the booth. That's an historic support from those people. And what I've been offering them is truth and honesty. Now, they're not 100% pleased by what has been proposed so far, and neither am I, but neither is anybody. But at least they're getting truth and honesty from this government, something they didn't get from the previous government. Now, the ALP has put up two what you might call greenskins to speak to this bill. I might term the Honourable Member for Barton a greenskin, but I don't know what I'd term the Honourable Member for Grayndler, because I know he's been in there very much of an activist for the left. But the problem he's got is he can't get his way against the massive right in the New South Wales Labor Party. I mean, they've buried him under concrete before, and they would bury him under concrete in asphalt again. So he's got no say, he's got very little say within the Labor Party, and I know that the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. The Labor Party has not achieved anything over the last 13 years with respect to this issue, except a tape. There's a tape that's going around. It was put out before the last election, I believe. I haven't yet got a copy.
Order, the Honourable Member's time has expired. Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The Honourable Member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to again address the comments which have been...
Order. The Honourable Member is going to seek leave to speak again and not close the debate.
I seek leave to speak in the debate as there is still time.
Speak again and not close the debate. Is
Yes.
leave granted? Leave is granted. The Honourable Member for Grayndler.
Thank you. I rise to indicate my disappointment perhaps at the member for Lowe's comments. I'm disappointed that if there are so many problems with my bill that's been put up, the member for Lowe couldn't even speak for 10 minutes on it. Couldn't get to 10 minutes, got to 7, wound out of puff, because the reality is there are no criticisms of substance of my bill. The fact is that we will, myself and the member for Watson, will accept any reasonable amendments based upon any drafting considerations which you're concerned about. We will do that and accommodate any requirements which you have. In fact, you knew that because I wrote to the Minister for Transport on about 12 days ago, on the Wednesday of the last sitting, and indicated there that I would be happy to have another meeting with him to make sure there was a consensus position before this Parliament with regard to my bill. What I received was this morning, to be fair, a courtesy call from the Minister's office, but no meeting, no discussion about drafting problems. Myself and the seconder of this bill do not have a whole department at our disposal. Do not have a department. But what we've managed to do is put this issue on the agenda, something that the Minister with a whole department with thousands of advisors couldn't do, something which a government with an overwhelming majority couldn't do, something that the Sydney Airport Community Forum, before I moved the resolution last Monday, hadn't done.
Order. The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting.